On today's show, we are sitting down with Wes Kao. She is the co-founder of Maven. She worked with Seth Godin on the altMBA, and we are breaking down a masterclass in leadership, management, and how to be a true marketing craftsperson. You are going to be taking tons of notes today. It is a tremendous show. Let's get to today's episode.
Well, you have built many incredible businesses. Wes, we appreciate you coming on. Where we really wanted to start was on the altMBA. Actually, could you maybe start us off with, how did you get partnered with Seth, right? That feels like it was a pretty big break in your career. How did you end up partnering with him in this course?
Yeah, so this was 2014. I was in San Francisco working at a Sequoia-backed startup, and I'd been there for 3 years and was kind of done and ready for something new. And on a whim, a friend had, randomly sent me a blog post of Seth's saying that he was looking to hire a special projects lead for 6 months in New York. And, like many people from SF, I was like, oh, I kind of want to move to New York. So it felt really perfect. And so I applied, threw my name in the ring, and I really didn't expect much from it because I knew how competitive a role like this would be. And, 2 days later, I see Seth in my inbox, which was shocking. And he said, hey, I liked your application. I liked your video. Let's hop on a call for an interview. So we did a couple rounds of interviews. We met up in person for another interview as well. And then I was hired.
What was the video? It sounds like you had, how did you differentiate your application if you were one of many people trying to get into Seth's orbit?
It's so funny because I did my video in one take. I thought I was not going to get this anyway. And, all of us have spent too much time laboring over an application and just never hearing back. And I just didn't want to invest that emotional labor. And so I think the video was something like, take 3 minutes to share what you want to build, what you'll contribute, and what you want to learn, something like that. And so I did in one take, sent it over. Yeah, I guess something about my background stood out. I was doing a lot of side projects, I think, all along the way up until then. And so talking about some of the things I was doing outside of work, I'd been writing my blog for a couple of years since 2010, and I've continued that, all the way to today. So talking about some of the other ways that I think beyond, showing up at work and clocking out, the ways I was excited about marketing and really obsessed about it, I think that stood out.
Well, this is great craftspeople do side quests. If you are a marketer and you are trying to get any type of role, then the beauty of marketing in the digital era is that you don't have to wait for someone to give you a job to build an incredible portfolio of work. And I've always found the same thing, that the best people at this craft are people who do side quests, which is the same thing as side hustles. I just don't like the word hustles.
Yeah.
And so you have you have a huge audience as well. You're a prolific writer, but whatever it may be for that person, that's why when I fell into digital, like from a software engineering background, I just love that I could just go do it myself, right? I didn't have to, back then you could go and be like the best person at SlideShare. You could go have an incredible blog follower. You can go optimize a website and do black hat SEO. You shouldn't have done that, but I did that and ranked really highly in Google. Like all of these things were open to you. I remember even when I first applied to HubSpot back in the day, that's how me and Kipp actually met. And one of the things they called out was I had this weird fashion brand. Do you remember, Kipp?
Oh, of course.
And it was me and two of my brothers who had dropped out of college, and we had this fashion site for men's fashion. And then we were really early on YouTube and trying on shoes. And these videos would get 250,000 views, just us trying on new trainers. And then we managed to get ourselves sent all of the latest sneakers, which was really cool. But when someone talked about why did you hire Kieran years later, they're like, oh, we just loved he was really weird and did this really weird fashion thing, right? These side quests are super important.
Yeah, I think now more than ever before, it's so much easier to create proof points of your expertise online. And there's really no one stopping you. I think that's the best part. It's tough if there are other gatekeepers and whatnot, but back then I did ad campaign teardowns. So, Kieran and I were talking about Airbnb right before we started recording. And I don't know if you remember back in SF, I don't know when this was now, but Airbnb had these issues with different cities. And so they did bus campaigns and ad campaigns all over the city, basically kind of these snarky campaigns because the city was trying to block them. And I did this teardown rewriting the copy of these ads to make them, I thought, more productive and more effective. Instead of antagonizing the people that you were trying to convince to be on your side, what if you appeal to them instead, right?
Wow.
So that was something that I did. I had a salon series for women in leadership, sharing 5-minute lightning talks about learnings, hard-earned lessons that are harder to share in a public forum, but within a group of 30 some women, felt more comfortable to share, so I pitched a bunch of publications to try to get published, failed a lot, but eventually got published by Fast Company. So, just like caring about the work and actively thinking and then just trying to do stuff, I think that is just such an important attitude.
Well, and what you did and what Kieran you did in your shoe example is like there are a lot of people who use excuses to not just go and do something, right? Like, oh, I want it to be perfect, or where is this going to publish it? You were just like, oh, I actually just feel really passionate that this campaign could be better. So I'm just going to like publish on the internet what I think a better version of this would be. And literally anybody can do that and do it pretty quickly. Most people just choose not to do it.
I think there's also a big difference between writing online and trying to grow your audience. I think a lot of people conflate the two. For the first 10 years of writing online, no one read my shit.
Exactly.
I understand that.
The truth, and I was still doing it because it was an amazing way to sharpen my own thinking, to clarify my thoughts, to explore things that I thought were intellectually stimulating and interesting, share my observations. So I think a lot of people get discouraged with doing anything because they think that, well, if I only get 5 likes on it, then that's going to be embarrassing, but who cares? Just do it.
Kipp, this is actually reminds me of the conversation Kipp and I had this week. We were talking about something and Kipp made a really good point, which is, look, no one wants to do the hard work to be great at something. And so that's your moat, right? So like you spent 10 years perfecting your craft, and then your audience starts to like catch up to like where your expertise are, where your abilities are at some point. Because we live in a world where you expect to get success in such a short period of time online, right? And to your point, the people that I meet who really want to get better at craft and writing and creating videos, they just have a fear of failure, and their failure to them is like no one liked the first couple. No one is going to like the first a lot, right? Like it's kind of like, it's not too different. Like it's different, a different scale, but it's like what an entrepreneur goes through, right? You have to just put out there, iterate, get better over time, and then customers will eventually use your product. But you can't be scared to go out with an inferior version of your product, right? You're going to test, polish. Content is kind of similar, right? You have to embrace the grind. You have to embrace falling flat on your face. Like one of the places I think you experienced that more than anywhere else is when people are trying to get good at conference speaking. And I always talk to people when they're asking me like, how do I get better at content? And I try to explain, you have to just embrace the test and polish, like put things out, learn, test, polish. Conference speaking is a really good example of that because you're falling flat on your face in front of like a bunch of different people, and everyone goes through the same cycle. They start off with the bad deck, and then they learn how to craft a story in a deck, but then they present in a monotone way, and then they get better to actually bring some sort of excitement and differentiation of voice, and then they can move from like an educational talk to a big thinking talk and like change the way people think. But that's like a 10-year process, right? It's not like you start there in day one. And so I think it's a good reminder for people that you have to start at the start and try to enjoy the process.
Yeah, I think that's also a great reminder of how important craft is. I think a lot of people think that enthusiasm and confidence are enough to get to where you want to go. And there's a lot of skill involved often in the thing that you want to do.
Well, so I think there's a couple things, Wes, that I would push on is I think there's a 3-legged stool of marketing failure. It's enthusiasm, confidence, and then it's also strategy. People think strategy solves everything, and it doesn't. Like not that strategy isn't important, but like if you don't have the core craft skills, the best strategy in the world isn't going to save you. Right? Like you have to have the fundamental skills of the craft, and strategy isn't how you build skills. Strategy is how you utilize the skills once you've built them.
Hey guys, real quick. We've gotten a ton of requests in the comments, and they're all about prompts. You all want the prompts we're talking about on that show. We see you. We hear you, and now we are ready to share the goods. Click the link in the description below to access our new AI prompt library. This resource features real AI prompts that Kieran and I have covered on this show. We broke them down by category and templatized them so you can fill in the blanks and make them your own. Now you have the frameworks you need to use AI, analyze ads, create brand campaigns, develop product stories, just to name a few of our favorites. Keep telling us what you need in the comments, and we'll see what we can do to whip up more for you in the future. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I have this whole thing about strategy. I'm still trying to unpack a clean way of explaining it, but for a long time now, Okay, all right. It's going to be a little messy, but for a long time now, I feel like when people think of strategy, they think of strategy with a big S, like the company strategy, the quarterly strategy, the marketing strategy, whatever else, right? So you're getting a bit more function specific, but like still like very much like high level. But I actually feel like there's a lot of strategic thinking in the day-to-day execution. Once you've decided that macro strategy, when you are executing that thing, whether it's a project, an initiative, a task, every level of detail and concreteness, there's strategy involved. And I wonder if useful to separate out strategy versus strategic thinking, because not everyone is responsible for crafting a high-level strategy. But I would say that everyone is responsible for strategic thinking. No matter how well scoped something is by the time it arrives on your desk. Like, I was working with a client the other day and they said that they had asked their direct report to brainstorm a list of clients to do a case study on, right? So like that's like a fairly defined task already, but there's still a spectrum of how strategic you can be when you're doing that. Because that person came back and gave a really quick list of customers off the top of their head that they had a good relationship with, right? So like that's one dimension of many variables that you should consider, and so that person, my client had to coach their direct report on, well, the goal of why we're doing case studies is to attract more customers of the kind that we want, right? To like celebrate the kind of customer we want to attract more of. We want to drive revenue with these. We want to use them as sales collateral, thinking about making sure there's representation of your case studies with the clients you work with within different industries, right? We have clients in beauty, in entertainment, in finance, in tech, like not having all the case study brands be from one industry because you happen to have good relationships with the person there, right? So I think that's just such a good example of needing to think strategically and how there's judgment involved really in every aspect of what you're doing when you're executing, that I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't acknowledge that. When we only celebrate people who do strategy with a big S and consider everything else execution.
Well, so I want to try something on both of you. The capital S strategy is really just an exercise in focus. It is, hey, I could do all of these things. I'm going to pick a very small subset of these things to do. Strategic thinking is, all right, of the things I've picked, how am I going to get the best outcome in the fastest way possible by being very strategic in the craft and execution that I'm doing along the way in this thing that we picked and said like, hey, this is important. This is what we're going to do. And we're going to go chase after it. And it turns out that capital S strategy is like monthly, quarterly, annually. It's not that frequently, but strategic thinking is all day, every day. Really.
I actually think that this is a pretty good segment for marketers in general, because what I see is a marketer has done something for 6 months and then in their review, they're like, hey, now I'm ready to move to strategy. I've done 6 months of marketing. I just want to go do strategy. And I think people think, well, strategy is like I can like figure out how to move the pieces around and get people to do the thing that I believe in. But the strategic thinking is where you actually make yourself invaluable, right? That's actually the people who make the most money, or the people who actually who understand enough about the craft and have deep expertise in the craft that they can do enough strategic thinking to do that execution, like quote unquote execution, better than anyone else. And to Kipp's point, the strategy with a big S is pretty infrequent, right? It's not, and I do agree, actually, I think that's a good way of framing it. It actually really is just, I could do 10 things, we should do 3 things because we've strategically understood that these 3 things are the best thing for the business in this moment in time. But the real value then is in the strategic thinking that helps you to out-execute anyone else.
Yeah, and this reminds me of the Lord of the Rings meme where I think Boromir says, one does not simply do strategy.
Yes.
Like I feel like especially at startups, people think they, Kieran, to your point of like 6 months of executing and then moving into strategy, that very few people at a startup just sit around and think all day. Like that just doesn't happen. Like,
people think strategy is philosophy and you're like, nobody philosophizes.
No, like even very senior people are often either doing some IC work or very close to the work, by editing and monitoring and being deep with their direct reports on getting closer to the primary data and like figuring out what's going on. Like there's craft and doing at all levels, So right. I like the term strategic doer because there's a strategic part, but it's also like the doer is the noun. The noun is important, and it's a doer.
Well, we got here because we were talking about Seth, and Seth clearly picked you because you're a doer and you're a crafts person who ships things. I want to go back to that for a second though, because I have some friends who've worked with Seth and have written some books, with Seth as their editor, and I've heard that Seth is just like the most amazing editor and provider of feedback to like drive clarity. Like, what did you learn in that time with him on that front?
This is hard to answer because working with Seth was so incredibly transformational in every way that like it's hard to kind of pinpoint what are some lessons. But I have to echo, what those folks said in terms of feedback. Seth gave incredibly direct feedback, and he had incredibly high standards. I think one of the biggest things that I took away from working with Seth was drastically increasing my standards for myself and my expectations of other people. When I started working with him, I just come from this startup that I thought was pretty fancy. And we talked about shipping fast and breaking things and sprinting and whatnot. And within the first couple of weeks of working with Seth, I realized that the speed at which we were shipping before, that I was shipping at this previous company, was extremely slow. And it's just fascinating because at the time I thought it was fast, so it was kind of like seeing in black and white and then seeing in Technicolor. I'm like, oh my God, there's this whole other dimension of like speed or something, right? And so really raising my standards is a huge one. And that's something that I think is
how did that tactically show up? Just for people watching, Wes, who are like, yeah, I'm not good at that. I want to raise my standards. Like, how did you actually do it? So
here's a fun story. When we were figuring out the book list that we wanted altMBA students to read, we were going to ship everyone a box of books. And I came up with 20 some books. We narrowed it down to like seven or eight. And, they arrived on Amazon, slams this stack of books on my desk. And it's like, okay, like go through these. Let me know which ones, we should recommend. We should include in our book box. And I was like, okay, great. Like maybe I'll read, one every 3 weeks or something and like, figure it out. And he was like, you should read all of these books by the end of day tomorrow. And I was like, what? Like, my first thought was that's impossible. And then my second thought was, okay, like if I had to do it in 2 days, I could figure out a way to do it in 2 days.
How would I do it?
Right, exactly. And so like that's just an example of like breaking the frame. Like whatever frame you have, Seth will break that frame in the best way possible. And I think as leaders, that is part of our job, is to break people's frames, especially, I remember at Maven had a team member who came from Google, and she was used to working in a certain way. It's a much bigger organization. I think Maven was like 5 people at that time, and so it was a lot of frame breaking and resetting the frame. And I think if you are able to reset frames for people, they're able to then see through that new lens, and then every decision thereafter about the tactics and details becomes a lot more intuitive than if you were to try to correct like every tiny little thing.
I think that is a really great piece of advice. Like, how do I increase standards within my team? What's your thoughts on, that's Seth asking you to do that, right? If I'm a manager, what do I need to have where my team will react in a positive way versus, my reaction just being, oh, I can't do that. Like my manager is just asking me to do things that are just completely unreasonable. Like, is there something, is it just the ask? Like or do I have to demonstrate it, you think, in some way? I'm trying to figure out, like, if I'm a typical manager and I'm like, I really want to increase standards, so I'll just go and shrink the delivery time on some of these things that I think the team could be delivering on much faster. Is there some amount of trust you have to have earned beforehand, or do you have to demonstrate that you are also hitting standards throughout your work? Like, what do you think is the way a manager can bring that into their team?
Yeah, great question. I think the wrong way, and I think the way that most people do it, most managers, is announcing that we are now raising our standards. We now have a higher bar. And then just like, all right, great. Like everyone, Godspeed, right? Like that isn't going to give your team the support that they need to rise to the occasion. And so, if you think about a 2x2 matrix where it's low standards, high standards, and then low coaching, high coaching, you really want to be in the category of high standards and high coaching, in my opinion. I think that's where you really set the bar, but also on a day-to-day basis are giving the structure that people need to hit the standards that you want. There are organizations where it's high standards, and they're in the quadrant of high standards, low coaching or low feedback. And so that's kind of sink or swim. So that's, GE, Jack Welch, McKinsey, like freaking get with the program and do it, or like bye, So like, but people who choose to work at those companies are aware of that. So I think you just have to be transparent. If that is your culture and your expectation, you just have to be upfront about it. But if you're doing an organizational leveling up, with people who already are used to working with you in a certain way, it's super jarring to all of a sudden say that, what you used to do doesn't cut it. It worked yesterday, but it doesn't work today, without being more detailed with feedback and offering more coaching in a tactical, specific way.
What's interesting is spend some time with Frances Fry, who teaches at HBS and has written some great books. Her new book, How to Move Fast and Fix Things, is very good. And she had a separate version of that 2x2, because like what your 2x2 was is what you as the manager were supposed to do. Her 2x2 was like basically the emotional component around it, which is like people either hold people to extremely high standards or they have like unwavering devotion for their success. They rarely have both. Right? Like when you really want somebody to be successful, sometimes you don't feel like you can be direct. You don't want to hold them to high standards because you are like, oh, I want to support that person. I want that person to feel good about the work they're doing. And it turns out for somebody to feel great about the work they're doing, they need your support and your coaching, to your point, Wes, but they also need the very high standards so that they are like learning and growing and developing. I think both of those frameworks work really well if you're out there in like a leadership position trying to say like, oh, I want my team to be better.
Yeah, definitely. I think also another thing that makes it easier for your team to want to do better is if you yourself are great at the craft.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I think that really does matter. I think there's this whole debate of, do managers and leaders need to be craftspeople themselves? Can you be a professional manager? And I think there's a certain amount of respect that you engender with your team when you show that you've still got it.
Yes.
Right? Like you don't usually write copy. Okay. The boss does not usually write copy, but when they come in and do a little before and after on something, you're like, holy shit, that was really good. And so knowing, as a direct report, knowing that your manager holds themselves to a high standard and is not expecting something of you that they do not expect of themselves as well, and they are constantly pushing to be better themselves, I think that adds that oomph that helps your team want to do better.
Can we touch on this? I cannot. You've done two things that I think make you already our number one guest. First of all, you dropped a 2x2. If you know anything about this podcast, Kipp and I are all about the 2x2s. And then this is like my most favorite leadership topic. So I put up a 2x2 on LinkedIn recently, which was the knowledge of craft versus seniority and role, right? So like if knowledge of craft is low or high and seniority of role is low or high, that the higher you get in your seniority for the average leader within marketing, the worse you get at the craft, right? And I basically made the point that if you're an aspiring leader, don't do it this way, right? Because you should not just become a glorified people manager. You should stay in touch with the craft. And I think a lot of it is don't just do the strategy, do the strategic thinking and show your team you can actually get into the work. I have never had the amount of like the comments that I have had around that, like it's up to like 300-400 comments, and they are so mixed. Now, a lot of people misconstrued seniority with age and thought I was being ageist, which I get. Like I maybe should have labeled it quicker. But if I was being ageist, I'm not in my 20s, so if I was being ageist, I was being ageist against myself. I meant the level that you were at, right? I would love to hear your take on that. Like, if you were advising aspiring marketing leaders, CMOs, like, do you believe that that the more you go, the higher you get up in seniority, not age level, that you should really stay ingrained in the craft? And how would you think about ways that they can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important as a leader to be close to primary data, as close as possible. Because as a leader, you presumably have better judgment than many of the folks you work with. Like, judgment is a spectrum. So, as you become more senior, skills, background, years of experience become less important, right? Because at a certain point, there's a lot of people with 20 years, 25 years of experience, but not all of them become CMO, or not all of them, continue to rise. And so I think it's really important to not get too far away from primary data, because often you are able to see things that your direct reports don't see. You're able to notice things that they don't notice, And so, one of the first things I do when a direct report says like, oh, like so-and-so wasn't interested in expanding their contract, or so-and-so, is at risk of churning, they sent this note, and I'll say, can you send me the thread or show me the email, and this happened a couple years ago where one of my direct reports said that this big instructor on Maven was not interested in running a cohort later this year. And when I looked at the email, I got the opposite conclusion, that actually I think she was really interested. She just didn't say, yes, I'd love to, like, sign me up. Like, it wasn't as explicit. But first of all, she didn't say no. So like, if someone doesn't say no when you're in a kind of a sales biz dev situation, like, take that as a yes and like push, right? So that was a good lesson. That was a good opportunity to calibrate on like, how do we read between the lines on this? And what should we do when clients respond in this way or customers respond in this way? So I just think that leaders, if you were able to notice more than your team members might, it's important for you to stay as close as possible to that primary data.
Right.
The other aspect is, I think it's very hard to find senior tacticians, because the more senior you get, the more people want to lean into big S strategy and managing other people and not necessarily doing the work. And if you are someone who stays close to doing the work, you automatically have a leg up in doing both strategic thinking and big S strategy, because you actually understand the culture and nuance of a platform, right? Like, there are nuances when you're posting on TikTok and creating content on LinkedIn versus Twitter versus YouTube. And if you're like very removed from all of that and you think it's all the same, you're not ever going to really win on any one channel or in any one approach. Like, you have to be deep enough that you understand the culture and vibe of a place. And I know so many senior marketers who like don't know the vibe of a place, because you see their posts and you're like, this is not the way people post around here, right? Like, you can tell that they don't really get it.
Right. Yeah, you can see that they're just not practicing the craft.
I have a really hot take on all of this that I want both of your opinions on, which is, I think we've had multiple generations of people who have just been brainwashed to think management and leadership is way harder than it is, and that they need to spend all this time learning about management and leadership. And I think that is all, quite frankly, bullshit. It's like not actually that hard. And that and I would actually make the argument that most of the most successful leaders and CEOs of the last 25 years have not been the best managers in the whole world, but have been incredible leaders and incredible craftspeople. Steve Jobs, super direct and exceptionally high standards, right? Like, he was not obsessed about the minutia of management. He was obsessed on delivering the best thing to the customers. David Senner on the Founders Podcast has been doing a string of shows on Jobs and Michael Jordan and Steven Spielberg and a bunch of folks. And it's like, the commonalities here across these people is that not that they were great managers, is that they were really great craftspeople who had unreasonably high standards.
High standards, to what Wes said earlier. Extremely
high
standards.
You don't need to spend 20 years learning leadership. Leadership's important, but it's an output of being a good craftsperson and collaborating with other people. That's kind of controversial.
That is a hot take.
That's very controversial. It's very controversial.
So my reaction to that is, I personally think it's not super productive when people use Steve Jobs as an example, because most people are not, you're not as much of a genius as Steve Jobs. Like, if you were that good at marketing, if you were that good at product, if you were that good at inspiring people, then like, by all means, like, be an asshole. People will put up with a lot when you are that good.
Yeah, but
the problem is, I think that many managers and leaders are not that good. So this actually goes to your point. So maybe we're saying the same thing of being really good at the craft, because he was very good at the craft. So maybe there's something around, the better you are at the craft, the less of the less experience you need to be as, a professional manager.
Yeah,
I do think that
right.
managing is a skill in itself, though. And I think that when we don't treat it as that, then you have a bunch of leaders who have no self-restraint whatsoever. Like, I've definitely worked with, leaders who just say whatever they want to, like, don't think about the cost of the emotional drain that they're causing their teams, right? So like, I think balancing the two is still worth thinking about.
I think you have to balance. I think there is a point in people's lives where they're like, oh, the craft I need to learn is leadership versus like, I need to maintain the craft that I was practicing, and I also need to be leadership. It's an and, learn leadership. It's an and, not an or. And I think a lot of people treat it as an or.
Yeah, that I completely agree with. And building on top of that, I think if you're not good at the craft, it's very hard for you to give specific feedback on the work output of what your team members are doing, right? Because I couldn't give feedback to engineers because I don't know anything about engineering, right? But then you have these leaders who are giving feedback to content marketers or to, social marketers or, SEO folks or paid media, and they don't have any experience with those fields. And so it's tough for you to get that deep. You can kind of stay at a high level and cite general frameworks, which I think too many leaders rely on generic frameworks. And I think that's a way of hiding because you can't actually get more specific with your feedback.
No,
because you don't know enough.
I completely agree. And I think the best leaders too, we're kind of going down this tangent, the best craftspeople and leaders are also just great students of culture, right? Like you might not be running paid ads every day, but you might be obsessed with YouTube and Instagram Reels and everything and see somebody run a sick ad that's taking advantage of a new format. And you can say like, oh, that was really good. Who did it? How did they do it? What ad unit did they do to do it? And like, then you are in the details. Like you can then talk to your team about that, even though you've never even run that ad before.
I completely agree. I think that's a great distinction. That is not necessarily that you had to have run campaigns yourself, but your ability to notice when something is spiky and interesting and there's something there. There's something there that we should explore. Like, I think that's enough to be able to then share that with your team. That requires taste. It requires judgment. It requires
curiosity and taste.
Plugged in. Exactly.
Can we just quickly talk about direct? Because we've talked about it a couple of times, and I want to actually ask a question. When we say direct, how can people bring direct into their work habits? Because in a lot of my experience, when people say direct, not historically, but in certain cases, I've seen people say, "Oh, I'm just direct." It's not. They're just rude, right? Like it's not. It's this kind of weird word. Whereas I think with the best people who are direct have high standards and are opinionated. So like the version that happens in tech a lot is I have an opinion, and what I'll do is I'll go into the Google Doc and I'll gently question things to see if eventually you believe the thing that I believe versus just telling you the thing I believe, right? But in a very like non-rude, dickish way. What's your version of how great leaders, like how are they direct? You mentioned Seth is direct. We've mentioned Steve Jobs is direct. He was actually known to be maybe a little bit direct on the being an asshole side of things, but what's a good version of direct?
Yeah, I think people use direct as an excuse and carte blanche to basically say whatever they come to mind, without thinking about how the other person might respond. And so I think that's extremely lazy. I think that actually gives the word direct a bad reputation because people are misusing it in that way. I think being direct is saying what you think, sharing your recommendation, sharing your observation without mincing words, and sharing your logic, rationale, and thought process. Mm-hmm. I think that latter piece is the piece that is often missing. People will say this like mic drop thing and then just leave it. Whereas if you added your logic, rationale, and thought process, you explain how you got there, how you got to your conclusion, and you're also using that to convince the person of your point of view. I think it's pretty entitled to, say an abrasively direct thing and then just expect people to come along and understand and do the hard work of understanding you. Whereas if you were to share your thought process and put a little bit of thought into framing it so that they understand your point and are more likely to agree with you, that is ultimately what you want to get to, right? Like you ultimately want to get to a better outcome or alignment or getting their buy-in or whatever. And that requires you to give a little more for people to work with.
What's interesting is like, I think that was the perfect distillation. It's like when people are rude, they just say the what. They just say what they believe, right? Or what they want to have happen. When they're direct, they give you the what, the why, and the how they got there, right? It's like, this is why I think this, and this is how I got to my rationale and how I thought about this. And it's like, most people are just too impatient to take the time to give that level of depth of understanding.
It does take more effort
Yes.
to explain your thinking. So yeah, I think it's worth it though, because you get the person to agree with you more if you take a few moments to do that. I was going to say that I've said incredibly direct things to people about the quality of the work not being up to par and torn work to pieces many, many times. And people love it. Do I just work with masochists? I don't think so. I mean, maybe a little, but like, I think if you tear something to pieces, but do it with care and thoughtfulness and detail, and you give feedback that is tactical, actionable, concrete, and specific, I call it TACS, TACS. If you hit those elements, the person is able to do something with that feedback. They're able to learn from it. They're able to pattern match better going forward. They're able to understand your edits. And most people are incredibly thankful that I took the time to tear apart their work. So you can be incredibly direct if you also are not lazy and are willing to actually explain the edits and make the thing better and explain why you made it better.
Right. You provide the context of why. I think most people will prefer if their leader just tells them what they think and why. I think in tech over the years, there's actually a framework, I can't recall what it was, where it was like, hey, a really great manager leads people towards their thinking with inquisitive questions. I think that's the worst way to manage a team, right? Like try to get them all to agree with you with this kind of like weird way that I'm going to question and, you know, have you come along with me as I curiously dig in versus just tell you what I think and why I believe that, right? Like here's the reasons I believe that. And I think people, if you pair that with, look, we have high standards here. Here's what I believe great looks like. Here's how I believe we can get there. And like, this is why I think that way. Then I think people feel more comfortable. At least I get to learn what Wes thinks great is, right? I'm not trying to second guess what she means by these little questions in my work. Like, do you really believe you should have this here? Do you really think it should look like that? Do you really believe this is the right color palette? Like, I think that makes people feel much more nervous and uncomfortable with how to actually work with that leader. They don't really know what they want from them.
I do think that there's a way to ask questions where you're giving the other person a chance to fill in the blanks and to think rigorously for themselves. So the examples of the questions you gave, I think are too soft and vague. And yeah, whereas saying something like if I'm editing email copy for customers, I might say like, there's too much cognitive load here. Like where do you see the cognitive load? And then have the person point out, oh yeah, like I'm mentioning too many of the wrong details, not enough of the right ones, or like I'm going way too long about this thing when like that's actually not important. So that is confusing for the customer. So I want to give them a chance to think about where they could improve this thing, you know, without me saying the exact details.
But you did start with, I think the difference is what you give an opinion and then provided them the option to solution it. Whereas the version that I see happen a lot is that person would have said, do you think there's too much cognitive load there? And even though they do think that, they think, oh, the softy approach, like I'll just ask them the question and they'll come to the realization themselves. Whereas you're like, no, I believe there is. Like, how do you think we can actually improve that? Because it just shortens the time to get where we need to go and move a little faster.
Yeah, I love that. I also think that it's important to encourage your direct reports to question you as well and to speak up and be very direct too.
100%.
So whenever I have a strong opinion, I always say, like, if I'm missing something or if you see it differently, I want to hear your point of view. Like I want to hear what you think. And because it's very possible that I potentially overlooked something or like I'm misinterpreting it or whatever. And, you know, when your team does disagree with you or they share a different point of view, I think it's super important to celebrate that behavior. So like, don't just like go hard on debating right away. I always want to celebrate that because it is scarier for them to say something to you than for you to say something to them due to that power dynamic. Yeah. So, you know, if they voice an opinion, if they voice, you know, a strong point of view, I always say like, yes, I love that. I love that you shared your point of view here. These are the aspects I have questions on, or like, I'm not sure I agree with these things, but I want you to keep doing this. Keep sharing your point of view like this. This is fantastic. This is allowing us to really move forward, you know, faster and point out different things that, you know, all of us might be noticing. And so, you know, keep doing that.
This is another thing I couldn't agree more with. I would say that the number one reason I have seen leaders fail is because they don't have the trust with their team for their team to give them direct feedback. And what happens is 6 months down the line, there's all of these problems within their team. And then you do these kind of biannual 360 things. And that's where they feel there's anonymous feedback, or they give the feedback to the 360. And that team is in total disarray. And maybe the even relationship is unrepairable, and building that trust to get direct feedback from your team and reacting well to that feedback, like just hearing them. And what I have always done is like, I will tell my team, I will listen, debate, and I will act on some, and I won't act on the stuff that I don't think is, like, I just don't agree with, but I'll tell you which category of feedback each piece you give me is in, right? Because I don't think you want to be the manager who says, yeah, if you get any feedback you give me, I agree with it, and I will act on it. Like, you actually want to tell them the things that you think are important. But that is actually the number one thing that I have seen go awry for leaders, is they are not good at taking feedback. So they don't encourage it because they don't like getting it, and they get it through these anonymous forms that companies do. And by the time you get that, the relationship, sometimes the relationship is irreparable with their team. It's like, it's really hard to get a team back on side with you if they just have not that trust with you and you've damaged it in some sort of way.
I think people in general are pretty good at picking up on awkwardness and tension, but we are afraid of conflict. Most people are wired to avoid conflict, and so we default to politeness. And so, like, you can probably tell, I think you can tell when your direct report is not that happy or is struggling, or, you know, there's some weirdness happening between you two. And I think people choose to ignore it and be in denial because they're not sure how to deal with that conflict. And then so they wait for these structured periods, like 360 performance reviews, to, you know, to be these forcing functions where you talk about things. And I think it's not that you don't realize that there's weirdness, you know, to Kipp's point of, like, you know, a lot of leadership, I think, is, some of it is relatively intuitive, but I think people just don't want to face the truth and, you know, then have to admit to themselves that they are afraid of having that conflict or that conversation with a direct report. I'm working on an essay now for my newsletter on the topic of what I call positive confrontation. And I've been thinking about this concept for a long time. And it's basically, it goes beyond feedback. You know, it's not only feedback, although that is one type of positive confrontation. I think that a leader's job is to confront people, projects, problems at all levels, all the time, every day. And I think if we think of confrontation as this negative, heavy, awkward thing that's going to drain your emotional energy preparing for and then trying to execute, we're gonna avoid it. You know, whereas if you reframe it as, this is my job, it is to confront, and I need to get better at learning how to confront people in ways that get them to do the thing I want them to do, you know, and be excited about it, and to hold them accountable in ways that feel very reasonable to them. Like that, I think that is the goal of positive confrontation, is you hold people accountable. You don't just let things slide. People go through all this effort to set these great, beautiful goals, boundaries, and then the minute the rubber hits the road, it all goes to shit because you're not holding anyone accountable.
Exactly.
And so you just wait until the next cycle.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You need to confront people, you know, on a more frequent basis.
Accountability is the input to high performance teams, and managers who are not great or haven't been coached to be great are really bad at holding people accountable. And that's why teams resort to being mediocre. And it all comes back to, like, something you said right at the start, is like having that trust with your team to have high standards, and having the knowledge within the craft to be able to explain why that high standard matters and how to actually get there. And I think if you can do those things, you're going to be much more successful. Maybe we'll just end on Wes, you mentioned that leaders hide behind some generic frameworks. Are there any great frameworks that you would like leave our listeners with as ones that you think great leaders actually should adopt?
There's one that I call strategy, not self-expression, which is when you are giving feedback, the reason most feedback conversations fail is people use it as a time to vent, to share all the ways that I've been frustrated with you and for you to understand how I've been feeling, right? And, you know, they try to have the last word, teach someone a lesson, and that doesn't work. 90% of what you want to say initially is probably self-expression. The part that you should say is the 10% that is strategy. And that is the parts that will get the person to change their behavior. So that might look like not harping on, you know, the thing that they did and all the ways it impacted you, but more, you know, a little bit on that and more on going forward. Here's what you should do instead, right? Or can we agree on doing this thing instead? And so I think that it takes an incredible amount of self-restraint, because usually by the time we have an awkward conversation, we're done some mental gymnastics to try to convince ourselves it wasn't a problem until it really became too much of a problem to be able to ignore. And so really thinking about what's the 10% of strategy that I can say here that will actually get me closer to the outcome that I am looking for, and only saying that part.
I also think does a better job of your manager's impression of you is going to be much better. Like if you're solution oriented, strategic oriented versus just like what are all the ways that you've annoyed me in the past month? I think like managers react better to that as well. Like it actually is a better forcing function to build a healthy relationship.
Absolutely.
Cool. I love that we spent the entire podcast on leadership, Wes. This was awesome.
Kieran, there was so much you didn't cover. We're gonna have to have Wes
do a
back
part two.
at some
We're gonna have to do a part.
because-
When you come back from Spain, we can hear how your trip to Spain went, and then we can cover all of the rest. But we really appreciate you coming on. This is an invaluable episode for our listeners. I know they're going to get a ton out of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
We
so much,
appreciate you.
Kieran. Thank you, Kipp.
This data is wrong every freaking time.
Have you heard of HubSpot? HubSpot is a CRM platform where everything is fully integrated.
Whoa, I can see the client's whole history, calls, support tickets, emails, and here's a task from 3 days ago I totally missed.
HubSpot. Grow better.